Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'll recommend a bit of reading. I'm sorry to be immodest and to recommend my own book, but I have written a book about how the First World War came to an end. It's called With Our Backs to the Wall, and it's Penguin, and I've recommended some particularly pertinent chapters. But other things there's an older account, but I think it's very good on the politics of the armistice by Benedict Lowry, Armistice 1918, coming particularly from an American point of view. If you're more interested in the military side of the 1918 campaigning, there's an awful lot out there now, but I still think a book that's stood the test of time well is the book by the Canadian historian Tim Travers, How the War Was Won. But I can mention one more thing, a book which has just come out actually with Cambridge University Press, translated from the German, a book called On a Knife Edge by Holger Afflerbach. That's originally appeared in German. It's now been translated into English, and it's a very good account of the whole war, really, from the German perspective. Well written, very thoroughly researched. And his argument in summary, Holger Afflerbach's argument in summary, is that the Germans could have won the war, or at least could have achieved a draw had it not been for their own mistakes. In other words, we need to look at the mistakes on the German side as well as the strengths on the Allied side. And I think he sustains that argument very, very persuasively. But that's some suggestions about reading. And if people have got questions afterwards about reading in more detail, then they can always email me and I'll be happy to respond. But let's start here. We don't have many photographs or images of the armistice. But here is one. This is often reproduced. And Wagon 2491D, which is in the background, was the railway wagon belonging to the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits, which had come into service before the war as a dining car and is used for the armistice signing of the armistice documents and the final stages of the negotiations. In the front, you can see Marshal Foch, the Commander-in-Chief, General-in-Chief of the Allied armies on the Western Front. And you can also see the British delegates, particularly Admiral Vester Weems, who was the first Sea Lord, was the most significant, most senior British representative there. And behind other senior generals from the British and French side. And the Americans are not there. And I'll come to the reason why that was the case. The Americans were very important in the armistice and in many ways made the whole thing possible, but they're not involved in the actual final negotiations. It's a matter that's confined to the British, the French, and the Germans. The Italians aren't there either. But the armistice, as probably everybody knows, was signed on the 11th of November 1918, the 11th day of the 11th month. And it came into force at 11 a.m. There was actually signed at 5 a.m. And the reason for that, I understand, was that it's 6 hours, or at least the minimum time that was needed to get the message to all the fighting commands on the Western Front, if not further afield. Up until 11 a.m., the fighting continued, and there are many thousands of casualties in the final hours. The signature took place in the forest of Compiègne, which you can see in the background. Monday, the 11th of November, was a Monday, and it was raining. So in some ways, a rather downbeat end to 4.5 years of fighting. Some of those who lived through the armistice felt it was a kind of anticlimax, at least the actual negotiations, though not the aftermath. But what I want to do tonight is to look at how we got to that from the situation a year earlier, which is here is the Passchendaele battlefield, where it seems that the stalemate that had prevailed so recently in the middle years of the war was still continuing. Another way of looking at this problem, if you like, is to turn the question on its head, looking not at why the war ended in November 1918, but why it did not end much earlier. And the normal answer that's given to this is that World War I is a classic example of a stalemate war. It's interesting how lots of World War I parallels are being drawn now with the contemporary conflict in the Ukraine. And it's true, it is of course a stalemate war in the middle years after the failure of the initial war of movement in the autumn of 1914. There's a period during which on the Western Front there's remarkably little change in the territories held by the opposing sides, even in spite of the enormous casualties. So there is a military stalemate. Neither side can achieve a decisive breakthrough. The obstacles put up by the defenders, barbed wire, machine guns supported by field artillery, overseen by spotting aircraft and so on, and an enormous weight of firepower on both sides and very large armies. So a high force to space ratio, large numbers of men garrisoning each mile at the front. All of these things put together make a combination of factors which make it very difficult for a decisive breakthrough to be achieved, at any rate in France and Belgium. But underlying this are two further elements of stalemate. There's a domestic political stalemate. Until the Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia, governments on both sides remain in position which are committed to fighting on rather than achieving a kind of compromise negotiated solution. But in any case, looking at the third element of this, a compromise diplomatic solution would have been very difficult to attain because the two sides are simply too far apart. There isn't much scope of bargaining space. If you think, for example, of Belgium, just to take one touchstone in the Western European sphere, Belgium, there is a diametrical opposition between the British concern to restore Belgium to neutrality and independence as it had enjoyed before 1914, and the German intention that Belgium should remain, for the foreseeable future, a German buffer state under German occupation with German naval bases on the Belgian coast, German holding companies running the Belgian railway system and so on. There's no much ground really for a kind of compromise outcome between those two viewpoints. And one can see similar conflicts, intractable conflicts between France and Germany in the Rhineland, between Poland and the Central Powers in Poland. Between Russia and the Central Powers in Poland. So the war doesn't end earlier because of a triple stalemate, with the different elements of the stalemate reinforcing each other. It's not possible to get around a table and to negotiate a solution. Not possible until the Russian Revolution for a major regime coming to power, which is committed to negotiating at whatever price, and neither can either side overcome the military technology of the day, even if other fronts, like the Eastern Front or the Middle East, are more mobile than is the West, but the West is the decisive theatre of war. So that's a reminder of the contrast between how things end in the Eastern Europe and how they end in Western Europe. I'll be concentrating on Western Europe, but what was going on in Eastern Europe was very much in everybody's minds, of course, and influences the balance of power across Europe as a whole. But this again is I put the map in partly because of what's happening today, but this is a reminder of the terms of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Remember, there is a ceasefire in the East in December of 1917, followed through by a peace treaty in March of 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in Poland, as a result of which the Russian Empire, the former Tsarist Russia, cedes control of the whole of the orange shaded area here, which you can see includes much of what's now the Baltic states, includes most of central Poland, and includes the Ukraine, as well as the Crimea. The whole of that area the Russians cede control of in March of 1918, and it's transformed into a system of buffer states under German and Austrian military occupation. Not only that, but the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk doesn't actually end the fighting in the East, because the Germans and Austrians continue to advance. And by the summer of 1918, they've reached the purple line shown to the extremity of the map here. As late as November 1918, there are still 500,000 German troops, garrison troops, operating in Eastern Europe. Troops by that stage that were sorely needed in the West. So what happens in Eastern Europe is that the triple stalemate is broken, first of all, if you like, politically. The Bolshevik seizure of power in the October Revolution, Red October. October by the old Russian calendar is actually early November by the Western calendar. Bolshevik regime comes to power and is committed to making peace as to ensure the survival of the regime at home. Carrying on with the war is likely to lead to the socialist system being overthrown in the same way as the Tsarist system had been. So Lenin and his advisors are willing to concede basically whatever the Germans demand in order to get out of the war. And they have to in any case, because much of the Russian army has simply mutinied and gone home by the end of 1918. That's the situation in the East then. The domestic political stalemate element of the stalemate shifts first. That makes possible creates scope for diplomacy, and also the Russians have militarily lost decisively. Now, let's look at the timeline of 1918, having set out these kind of preliminaries, remind you of the sort of rhythm of the year as a whole. I've started with the 14 points, the 8th of January. This is President Woodrow Wilson's address to Congress, to both houses of Congress, where he sets out his peace program, deliberately moderate peace program. Its culmination, its climax is point 14, which is the proposal for a League of Nations to be set up. But it also has more detailed provisions regarding the various territorial flashpoints in Europe, and the opening 4 or 5 points set out a more idealistic set of general principles, including the principle that there should be economic non-discrimination, that there should be what's called an impartial adjustment of colonial claims, and so on. Now, the point about the 14 points is why it's necessary to highlight them is that in November, when the armistice is signed, it is done so partly on the basis of all parties accepting the 14 points, or at least 12 and a half of the 14 points. So the 14 points become the basis, the political basis on which the ceasefire happens. But to begin with, the important thing is that they are rejected. The Germans and the Central Powers reject the 14 points, essentially, in January of 1918. And there are actually only rather ambiguous responses from the Allies too, from the British and French and Italian side, because they too are challenged by the American peace program. So the 14 points kind of remains under the surface and then comes back to prominence when the Germans request a ceasefire on the 4th and 5th of October. But in that interval, between the 14 points and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in the spring and the armistice negotiations in the autumn, there's a phase of tremendous fighting, which roughly can be divided into 2 sections. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians are on the offensive between March and mid-July. 5 major German attacks on the Western Front, and also a major Austrian attack on the Italian front. And then there is the phase of Allied counteroffensives from mid-July until the 11th of November. And those Allied counteroffensives culminate with the Central Powers either disintegrating, as Austria-Hungary does, or suing for a ceasefire, as Germany does. The German ceasefire, the other aspect to stress about it from the beginning, is that it's accompanied by a revolution within Germany, by regime change on a very dramatic scale, with the abdication and fleeing to Holland of the Emperor Wilhelm II on the 9th of November, 2 days before the ceasefire documents are signed. So that's the timeline then. Negotiations of a sort at the beginning, but as usual, negotiations failing. More successful negotiations at the end of the year. And in the meantime, a trial of strength by force, which ends up very clearly in the favor of the Allies and the Americans. Now, simplifying the sort of structure of this timeline, what I want to highlight is that the reason why the armistice happens when it does is, first of all, that the German government asks for one. So the Germans request a ceasefire on the night and the 4th and 5th of October, 1918. The second point is that the Americans and the European allies, Britain, France, Italy foremost among them, agree amongst themselves to agree to a ceasefire, and they settle the conditions on which a ceasefire will be offered. These conditions are much tougher than the conditions that the Germans had expected. So it's not a foregone conclusion that the Germans will accept what the Allies put to them, but in the end they decide that they do, that they will. So there's 3 phases. There's a German request for a ceasefire. There's an Allied and American decision to grant a ceasefire, and a German decision to accept most, if not all, of the Allied and American terms. I'm going to say something under each of those heads. But they need to begin then with the Germans, and the Germans are overwhelmingly, predominantly the strongest of the Central Powers. So they do have partners in Bulgaria, Austria-Hungary, and Turkey. But it's Germany we need to look at to begin with. And here's Wilhelm II and his generals, Hindenburg, here on the right. And here are Hindenburg and Ludendorff, in other words, the two key people in the German High Command. Hindenburg on the left, Paul von Hindenburg, who is the chief of the General Staff, and on the right, Erich Ludendorff, whose title is First Quartermaster General, which doesn't really make clear exactly what his role is. He is the driving force in the partnership. He provides the energy, the ideas, drafts most of the key documents that go out on their joint names, which doesn't mean that Hindenburg is a cipher, but Hindenburg, if you like, is the front man who does the public face of the duo, and is the man who negotiates to an extent with other government bodies. And these people have been in charge of the Oberheeresleitung, the German High Command, since August of 1916. They've been brought in at a moment that the Germans perceive as one of crisis, after the general sequence of Allied offensives in the summer of 1916, which have put the German army under great strain. They have a position of great authority by the end of 1918. There is not going to be a ceasefire request from Germany unless these people back it. And they not just back it, they take the initiative in deciding that a ceasefire is necessary. Wilhelm II is afraid of them. Wilhelm II can't stand Ludendorff, but he gets on better with Hindenburg. Wilhelm II, the emperor, repeatedly gives way to threats from these two people that they will resign unless Wilhelm sacks civilian ministers who they disapprove of. This is what had happened, for example, to Bethmann Hollweg. Theobald von Bethmann Hollweg, who had been the German chancellor at the outbreak of the war, is forced to resign really in July of 1917, because otherwise Hindenburg and Ludendorff are saying that they will stand down. And when forced to choose, Wilhelm II will choose Hindenburg and Ludendorff over the civilian politicians, at least he did until almost the very end of the war. Similarly, in June of 1918, the foreign minister, Richard von Kuhlmann, had been foolish enough to say in the Reichstag that the war could not be ended by military means alone. This may seem a statement of the obvious in retrospect, but it was something that was anathema to Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and once again they insist on Kuhlmann being replaced, which he is. So they have in effect a veto power over German foreign policy. They certainly are the masters of the strategy and the direction of the war effort, but in addition, they extend very much into spheres of influence that would normally be seen as primarily for civilian politicians and for the emperor, rather than for the professional soldiers. So these are the people who matter. And why do they request an armistice? There are four headings. The German decision to seek an armistice, the key day is September the 28th, 1918. So you can see about 6 weeks before the armistice is actually signed. And on that day, Ludendorff has something akin to a nervous breakdown at headquarters, German headquarters in Spa in Belgium. It was quite dramatic. He fell down, reported to have been foaming at the mouth. He'd been under a lot of stress as the campaigning of 1918 had developed and the German armies had been steadily pushed back. It was obvious to all of those around him that he was drinking too much. He quarrels violently with Hindenburg. It becomes very difficult to cooperate with. His staff officers are so worried about his condition that they bring in a psychologist, Dr. Hochheimer, to give advice. And Hochheimer, according to the accounts, says that Ludendorff should work less, work shorter hours, try to confine himself to 4 hours a day, go for daily walks in the surrounding woods, and in the evening should sing German folk songs with his staff officers, which he did. He seems to have been a good patient, and his condition improved. But on that day, September the 28th, after his nervous breakdown, or whatever it was, he persuaded himself that it was necessary to gain a ceasefire urgently. And that evening he speaks to Hindenburg and finds that Hindenburg has come to the same conclusion, Hindenburg being a much steadier man and would be better able to withstand stress. But these two decide then that a ceasefire is necessary. as urgent and imperative. Why do they come to this conclusion? Well, I've highlighted 4 points here. The first thing is that there is a ceasefire in Bulgaria, so there's a key development in the Balkans. Secondly, there is a general offensive by the Allies in progress on the Western Front. Thirdly, the condition of the German army is deteriorating rapidly. And fourthly, they're afraid of revolutionary upheaval on the German home front. So let's look at each of those in turn. Map of the Balkans. The crisis that ends the war, sequence of events that ends the war, like the sequence of events that began it, starts in the Balkans. And it starts really on the 15th of September with an Allied offensive. Remember, there have been Allied troops holding the air. I don't know if you can see the arrow on the map, hopefully you can, but this is the Macedonian front, the Balkan front. Allied troops have been sent there in 1915 to try to save Serbia, prevent Serbia and Montenegro from being overrun by the Central Powers. They'd essentially failed in that. But they based themselves in Greece, particularly they've gone in Thessaloniki, and had established themselves in a long mountainous region running through Bulgaria, what's now Kosovo, and down into Albania. And there had been considerable fighting in that front in 1916 and 1917, and then a long period of relative silence, relative tranquility there during 1918. But on the 15th of September, there begins a major offensive, pioneered, spearheaded, if you like, by French and Serbian troops, but the British also take part. This is an extraordinary story and deserves to be better known, but it involves, to begin with, a breakthrough in the south along an area with bombardment and fighting in mountain areas up to 8,000 feet high. And essentially the Bulgarian army, which had been decaying for several months, been poorly supplied, and the Germans had withdrawn most of their troops from Serbia to fight elsewhere. What happens is the Allies break through. They move rapidly up the river Vardar. They herd the Bulgarians back towards Sofia, invade Bulgaria, and the Bulgarian government agrees to sign a ceasefire. This is the news that reaches German headquarters on the 28th of September and prompts Ludendorff's nervous breakdown. And I want to make 2 points, really. The first thing is that Bulgaria really matters. First of all, it means that the Germans and the Central Powers lose the use of the Bulgarian army, which comprises about 500,000, quite well-disciplined and well-armed troops, though their discipline is fraying. Secondly, the loss of Bulgaria, the terms of the ceasefire allow the Allies to occupy strategic points on Bulgarian territory, which means that this will essentially now be lost to the Central Powers, and it will split the Central Powers in two. Turkey can no longer be supplied over land across Bulgaria, nor can it be supplied by sea, so Turkey is in effect sealed off. Even more important, the Allies can advance through Bulgaria towards Constantinople, which is in fact what they did. So the Ottoman Turkish capital is exposed to Allied attack. So next point, Austria-Hungary now faces a critical situation in the Balkans with a much larger Allied army potentially able to push up into Hungary and into Austro-Hungarian territory. And finally, but often overlooked, is the case of Romania, which had entered the war on the Allied side in 1916, has of course the oil wells around Ploesti. Romania had been overrun by the Central Powers after joining the Allied side, and this means that the Romanian oil fields become actually the most important source of oil for the Central Powers' fleets and air forces. And the assessment that had been done by the German General Staff was that within weeks, if access to Romanian oil was lost, within weeks, much of the German Air Force would have to be grounded. German submarines would no longer be able to put to sea. And most of the German tank force, such as it was, say more about that later, German lorries would be unable to operate. So for all of these reasons, the crisis in the Balkans is really serious, but it's not the first time such a crisis had arisen. Indeed, when Romania had come into the war in 1916, Hindenburg and Ludendorff had been able to divert troops from other fronts and send them down there so that Romania was overrun and occupied for the next 2 years. That is not an option in September of 1916, because of what's happening on the Western Front, where we move here to the second thing. This is the Allied general offensive, which is in progress on the Western Front. Now, the maps are better, I think, at showing things than me talking. What this map shows you is how much more mobile the Western Front is in 1918 than it had been between 1915 and 1917. And the two aspects to this are, first of all, the German advances, 5 German offensives between March and July of 1918. 2 of them advance up to 50 miles. This is the March offensive, advances towards the key railway junction at Amiens, followed by one in advancing 30 miles towards the Belgian ports in April. And then in May, June, an advance again about 50 miles, halfway from the German front, where it's from starting point, to the Paris. So for a second time, there is fighting along the River Marne, and the French capital appears to be directly threatened. That's the situation between March and July. The situation between July and November is the reverse. The map here, the left-hand side, the broken line, shows roughly where the Allies are by mid-July, after these 5 German offensives opening up the, advancing towards the Channel ports on the one hand and towards Paris on the other. What the map shows is the phases of the Allied attack, counterattack, the Allied advance during what's normally frequently referred to in British literature accounts of the period as the 100 Days, series of offensives in the last 3 months of the war. The 100 Days is a rather Anglo-centric term which plays down the importance of other Allied forces. And one of the points I hope I can get across today is that the French, British, and Americans, all 3 play vital roles. It's not just a British victory in 1918, though the British certainly play a very prominent part within it. But the beginning of the 100 Days is not actually the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August, which is the battle I'll say something more about in a moment. The turning point is the Second Battle of the Marne in mid-July, which is the last of the 5 German attacks. It's down here, followed by an Allied counterattack spearheaded by the French and Americans. That's on the 18th of July. This is the beginning, really, of the Allied advances, which during August and September, what the Allies are essentially doing is reconquering the salients that the Germans had taken in the first half of the year. By late September, the Allies are in a position where they're able to start a general offensive. And what the map shows you is the general offensive, which is in progress from the 26th of September onwards. The blue arrows here show you the main lines of Allied attack. Sorry, let me go back one. The main lines of Allied attack. The Americans, supported by the French on the left, are attacking in the Meuse-Argonne area through a wooded, very difficult wooded and mountainous hilly country, advancing towards the railway. And I do want to highlight the importance of the railways. Here is the great trunk line, green, running from Lille via the great German fortress at Metz down towards Strasbourg. And here are the German feeder lines coming in from the Rhineland, from Koblenz in the north and from Cologne further north to that. And these are the 2 great German trunk lines which are running down and bringing supplies and men to the lateral railway that runs parallel to the frontier. The map doesn't unfortunately show the Allied counterpart to that, but there's a similar, if you like, counterpart to this, the French railway system running down from the Channel ports down through Hazebrouck, which is here behind Ypres, down through Amiens here, down towards Paris, and then across towards eastern France. So much of the Western Front fighting takes place between 2 great railway systems, one under German control, one under Allied control. What's happening in late September is that the Allies, under the direction of Marshal Foch, the Allied commander-in-chief, are attempting to overrun the German railway system. And they try to do this by three main pushes. I've mentioned the French and Americans in the south, starting on the 26th of September. This is the first one. Second one is the advance in the north, Belgian and British and French forces, running across the old battlefield of Third Ypres. I showed you Passchendaele in November 17. Fighting takes place over that area again in the north. And the middle thrust, which is predominantly British, though supported by American, French forces, but British Empire forces, but very predominant, in the central drive, which is towards the so-called Hindenburg line. That's the name the British give it. The German word for it was the Siegfriedstellung, or Siegfried position, but a Wagnerian kind of title. British forces on the 29th break through the Hindenburg line, the enormously strong German position that had been built, and the Germans had retreated to that in February of 1917, but then sallied forth out of it again in the spring of 1918. There are 2 points along the Hindenburg line, the Saint-Quentin Canal and the Canal du Nord, which are broken through by British Empire forces. And the actual date of the key breakthrough is the 28th of September. Sorry, it's the 29th of September, the day after Ludendorff's nervous breakdown. But by the time Ludendorff's nervous breakdown happens, the Germans are already very worried about the tremendous strain that their defending armies have been placed under by the Allied general offensive. This, in a word, and to cut the story short, this is the biggest battle of the war, and was known at the time to be that. The Allies are advancing with 100 divisions against retreating and very hard-pressed German forces. So point 1, remember I said, leading to the German change of heart and the German request for a ceasefire, is the Bulgarian ceasefire. Point 2 is the Allied general offensive that begins on September the 26th and is at its height by September the 28th and September the 29th, but then actually starts to run out of impetus. That's putting in a nutshell, in a timeline, the key dates in this so-called 100 days, the final Allied sequence of Allied offensives in the autumn of 1918. I've only put down the highlights here. There are several more. And that's one of the things to stress, actually, that there are several battles in the summer and autumn of 1918. What the Allies do not do, as they had done in 1916 or 1917, is to keep hammering away for 3 months or 4 months at a single sector of the front, as they'd done on the Somme in 1916 and as they'd done at Third Ypres in 1917. Instead, take, for example, the Battle of Amiens, the 8th of August. That is wound down after great success. It's wound down after 4 days, and the British then move their main offensive effort to another part of the front. So it's a succession of quick attacks, moving at great rapidity along the front. And the conditions for this, of course, are logistical mobility, but also great speed in battle planning. And I have actually a PhD student who's working on this and shows how the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, tremendously speeded up its planning process. And this is one of the reasons why they're able to do such short, effective, speedy attacks against up and down different sectors of the German line. And this, in the end, does actually overwhelm the German capacity to resist. But final German attack then on the 15th of July, the final German offensive. Allied counterstroke, the Second Battle of the Marne, French and Americans on the 18th. 8th of August, and I'll say more about this in a moment, is the Battle of Amiens, which is one of these battles that's probably best known in Britain. And late September, the start of the general offensive, with the Hindenburg line being broken on the 29th. In the interim, between July, August, and late September, a series of smaller battles as the Germans are driven back out of their gains in the first half of the year. The important point, kind of nutshell summary here, is that by late September, the Germans could neither win the war by attacking, That's been shown by the failure of the so-called Ludendorff offensives at the start of the year. Nor can they win the war by staying defensively and grinding the Allies down, as they looked as if they were able to do in the middle years of the war. Neither the offensive nor the defensive are viable strategic postures for the German army, and Hindenburg and Ludendorff understand that. Now, I said I'd say a little bit more about the Battle of Amiens. In some ways, this sets the precedent for the successful strategic combination that is followed by the British forces, but also by the French and eventually by the Americans as 1918 goes on. So there is a kind of revolution in tactics in 1918, but in many ways it's following on a similar revolution that the Germans have put through first of all. And it's not confined to the British Empire, it's also all of the Allies participate in this. The Battle of Amiens begins on the 8th of August, and this map doesn't, as the map shows, it's the starting point is to the south of the River Somme. They advance eastwards, and the initial objective is to push the Germans away from the key railway junction at Amiens, which they'd come close to capturing. A number of points, but it's also intended quite deliberately to deal a stunning blow to the morale of the opposing German armies, in which it is very successful, because Ludendorff famously in his memoirs describes the 8th of August as, quote, the black day of the German army. Black day of the German army. And why he says that is because of the reaction of the German troops to the Allied attack. The Allied attack hits them by surprise. The British take elaborate precautions to able to attack with surprise. They move up their artillery with sackcloth around the wheels and with overflying aircraft, concealing the noise coming from the assembling of tanks. They dispense with a long preliminary bombardment, so as not to give the Germans warning. The attacking force goes in 4 minutes after the start of the preliminary bombardment, only 4 minutes. Compare that with a week before the 1st of July 1916. The effect, anyway, is to achieve surprise, and another key element in what makes surprise possible is the provision of over 400 tanks, which in some ways dispense with the need to have a preliminary bombardment to silence the German machine gun posts. The British effort is very much a British Empire effort. It's Canadian, Australian, and British divisions. And to the south, on the British right, the French First Army also takes part and has similar success, but this is almost never written about in the Battle of Amiens. This is a picture from the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, perhaps slightly romanticised, but shows the importance of this being what would now be called a combined arms offensive. In other words, it's armour as well as infantry, and the infantry are supported by mobile cavalry, horse-drawn cavalry, moving forward across rolling plains, which is what the countryside is like east of Amiens. And there is a huge prisoner haul. Thousands of Germans surrender on the first day. German reinforcements being moved up are greeted by troops coming back from the front who shout at them and jeer at them as strike breakers. This story comes back to German headquarters, which is warned that there's been a catastrophic failure of morale among the German defenders who were taken by surprise at the Battle of Amiens. Now, I've mentioned tanks. Here's a German British Mark V, I think. The tanks are used en masse on 2 occasions in 1918. They're used for the French-American offensive against the Germans in 18th of July, and they're used at the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August. And they're very important in the initial Allied success in achieving surprise and in panicking the German troops. They are never used on such a large scale again, however, and for the rest of 1918, tanks are frequently employed, but in much smaller numbers for infantry support in more localized fashion rather than for a massed breakthrough. There's been a debate about the importance of tanks in the Allied victory. Remember, the Germans have hardly any tanks, except for some captured British tanks, on which they painted iron crosses. They do have their own weapon, the A7V, which is much inferior in performance to the Allied tanks and much inferior in numbers as well. Hindenburg and Ludendorff are never persuaded that the tanks are an important weapon, or at least they're only persuaded much too late. Tanks play a role in the Battle of Amiens, but they are less significant as in the tactical change than other technological and tactical developments. Most important is the role of heavy artillery. You see a British heavy gun in action. But I've mentioned that the heavy artillery are directed by aerial photography, producing pictures like that in tens of thousands and much more accurate maps than in previous actions, which enable this is part of a combination of devices that make it possible to locate the German gun batteries much more precisely and to silence them by indirect fire before the British infantry advance. Gas is used also by the Allies on a large scale, particularly, though this is a picture on the German side, of course, but gas is used particularly to silence the German artillery pits filled by filling them with poisonous fumes, and this is also very effective. The Allies get much better at retrieving surprise and at overrunning German positions with lower infantry casualties. But this, if you like, is the tactical improvements and technological improvements that the Allies are making. The Allies also get much better at intelligence. This shows prisoner interrogation. It's actually a French painting. In the first half of the 1918, it had been the Allies who had been losing thousands of their soldiers surrendering to the Germans. After July 1918, it's the other way around, and tremendous amounts of information come to the Allies from prisoner intelligence, as well as from aerial photography and from other various means. Particularly, one I would highlight is Belgian railway spotters who are reporting back to the British. These are Belgian patriots, if you like, partisans, who are spying and monitoring the German rail movements through occupied Belgium, and that information is relayed back to the Allies, and it becomes a very important source of Allied intelligence. So the Allies have an intelligence advantage, they have a logistical advantage, and they have a technological advantage. And this shows you again the front line. As I mentioned before, here's the front line in the middle of 1917, located between the two great trunk railway systems that I mentioned earlier on. And what happens, actually, just to highlight the importance of this, I've said that the Allies, under direction of Marshal Foch, their supreme commander, are deliberately from July 1918 onwards targeting German communications and logistical support networks, and particularly trying to overrun and capture the primary German railway network. On the 28th of September, so in other words, the day before Ludendorff's breakdown, on 28th of September, there is a very interesting document which is available in the German official history of the war, where the German High Command is reporting that they can no longer cope with the simultaneous Allied attacks under so many positions along the front, that the railway system behind the Hindenburg line has become clogged and is unable to operate anymore effectively. So the German logistical system is paralyzed, and that is one of the reasons for the German decision to seek a ceasefire. I mentioned two other decisions to seek reasons behind the decisions for the ceasefire. Point one was Bulgaria. Point two was the general offensive of the Allies on the Western Front. Point three was that the German army was disintegrating. I've mentioned several points about with relation to the 8th of August, but it becomes more and more clear as the summer turns into the autumn, and it's clear to the German High Command too, that their troops are not fighting in the way they had done before. It's not only that the Allies have got technological and logistical advances, that the Allies have got better at Western Front fighting, but the German army of 1918 is nothing like the German army which had resisted so tenaciously in 1916 and even 1917. That the troop morale has disintegrated, and there's been a lot of good research in recent years about this, showing how the numbers of German prisoners surrendering to the Allies increased, but also the numbers of German deserters. Something like 700,000 are milling around in the rear or simply gone back to Germany by the autumn of 1918. The German army is deflating, if you like a pricked balloon. It's the kind of metaphor that you could apply to this. And it's lost something like 1 million casualties between March and July. So between March and July, during the phase when it was on the attack. And these losses are simply losses that cannot be replaced. Whereas the Allies, of course, the British and French armies are also suffering heavy losses, but they're being replenished by the arrival of the Americans in very large numbers, something like 300,000 a month American combatant troops arriving in France by the summer months of 1918. So the numerical balance swings in the Allies' favor, and the balance of morale swings also in the Allies' favor, especially once British troops see very large, return to a more open warfare and see very large numbers of German casualties. This is very good for morale on the British side. I've mentioned Marshal Foch several times, the French general who becomes the General-in-Chief, is his title, of the Allied armies on the Western Front in March of 1918. There is a debate about how important his role was, but we can come back to that perhaps in questions, but he is the kind of mastermind. He has a kind of conception of what he's trying to achieve. First of all, at the conference in Bonbon on 24th of July 1918 is where he sets out to the British and Americans the plan to overrun the key German transport links. And he is also, his thinking is what lies behind the general offensive of September 1918. So he is important, if you like, in giving much greater concerted, coordinated guidance to the Allied strategic effort than had been the case a year or 2 years before. There's the scene after the British had broken through the Hindenburg line at the Saint-Quentin Canal. What does it is actually a Staffordshire division, the 46th Division, not one of the crack divisions in the British Army, but very effective in that particular operation when they get across the canal using mud mats and small boats taken from the Channel Fleet, and under the cover of a bombardment by 750,000 shells in the previous 3 days. This is a bit different from Amiens. Amiens, there's a hurricane bombardment which starts 5 minutes before the attack. The German defenses on the Hindenburg line are much, much more formidable. And there is a very intense bombardment before the Allied attack takes place. And of course, the precondition for that is a revolution in munitions production, particularly in Britain and in France. And one thing that's come out from recent research is how much more important Britain and France are than America. If the war had gone on into 1919, then the American industrial armaments contribution would have been enormously greater. But as of 1918, when the 2 million American troops arrive in France in 1917, 1918, they are primarily equipped by the French. Their aircraft, their tanks, Renault tanks, their 75mm field guns, all of these are of French manufacture. And of course, they also put great strain on the French railway system, moving across from the Western ports to the front line. But if the war had gone on into 1919, Britain would have overtaken France as the main munitions producer, because for various reasons, the British are suffering less from labor shortages and so on. But as of 1918, it's Britain and France together who are jointly, if you like, the most important armourers of the coalition, and are able with astonishing speed to make good the Allies' huge equipment and material losses that had taken place while the Germans were attacking until July. So underlying the Allied success on the Western Front then is a tremendous economic achievement. And one thing to stress actually, and again, I think more research needs to be done on this, but the British and French in particular are more effective in their use of women. As of 1914, Britain, France and Germany, all 3 cases, their manufacturing workforces were about a third female. In the second half of the First World War, the Germans are much less effective at using women in the armaments factories to replace men. Instead, what happens is what's called the Germans pass a law at the end of 1916, which is designed to give government more control of the labor force. What it's used for is to allow hundreds of thousands of men to leave the armed fighting forces and to go into the factories to produce the goods that Germany needs. And the German army in 1918 is well equipped with the basics, with shells, with machine guns, with rifles, with ammunition. But that's achieved at a price of starving the regular combatant forces and units of supplies. So German divisions are much smaller by 1918 than they'd been in 1916. British and French are better able to keep their armies up to strength, even though they're finding it very difficult. And a key reason for this is that the British and French have more success in incorporating women into the munitions labour force. Another thing that's lying behind the Allied success is sea power. Here we see a convoy, a painting actually, by the official war artist of a British convoy in the North Sea in 1918. Remember that in 1918, the Allied shipping losses to German U-boats are dramatically reduced. There's a whole background to that, which I think is perhaps better left to questions. One of the key innovations, but part of the key success is the convoy system, which is spread in 1918 from the North Atlantic to the North Sea, British coastal waters, and also to the South Atlantic. Here we see a convoy in the North Sea in the summer of 1918, which you can see has an air escort, has a British destroyer escort, and also the ships are zigzagging to make it harder for U-boats to target them. But this makes it possible, of course, for the Allies to supply their troops from all parts of the world and to bring in huge numbers of American troops. And not a single American troop ship is actually sunk on the outward west to east voyage in 1918. They're able to arrive by November 1918, nearly 2 million Americans in France and actually outnumber the British. So underpinnings of Allied superiority then, economic, sea power, manpower, as well as tactical and logistical innovation. Here is an American convoy. There are very few pictures of American troop convoys, but here is one coming into France in the summer of 1918. And here they are after they've arrived, the doughboys, the American troops, extraordinarily important for raising the morale of the French and British armies. But doing relatively little fighting themselves until the autumn of 1918. The first major battle on the Western Front, in which the Americans played a large part, was the Second Battle of the Marne in mid-July. And then the next one is the Saint-Mihiel salient being overrun by the Americans in late September. That's a relatively easy success. They then play a major part in the general offensive with the Meuse-Argonne attack. But their advance in the Meuse-Argonne to the south of the Western Front is held by the defending forces, by the Germans until the end of October. Now, German prisoners taken en masse, and the graph here shows you the numbers of German prisoners taken by the British Army in France, and you see how month by month, it enormously expands through August and September. This is just highlighting again, for the combination of reasons that I've been sketching up until now, the German army, or many of them, are persuading themselves by the autumn that the war can no longer be won. But with that, following from that realization comes a tremendous number of surrenders. Now, I want the last part of this, I want to talk a bit about the politics of the armistice. I've talked about why the Germans seek an armistice. The political element of this, the key person here is the foreign secretary, who is on the right, Paul von Hintze. On the left, I show you the German Chancellor, Count Hartling, who is the German Chancellor, the head of the German civilian government until the autumn of 1918, and he's replaced by a liberal, Max of Baden. And this is because what the Germans do when they decide to seek a ceasefire is they don't go to the Allies collectively, they go to America alone. They send a message to the American President Woodrow Wilson, asking for him to arrange a ceasefire and offering an acceptance of a peace based on the 14 points. There's a bit of ambiguity about that, which Wilson tries to clarify. What the Germans are trying to do, in other words, is to split their opponents. They see the American president as a relatively soft touch, who will be less stringent in his demands on Germany than Britain and France will be, and also to encourage the process, at the same time as appealing to the Americans, asking for a ceasefire. There is a renegotiation within Germany, and a new government is formed, headed by a liberal, Max of Baden, brings in the Catholics and the liberal and progressive, and above all, the Socialist Party in Germany, the SPD, to form a government which represents the majority in the Reichstag, the German parliament. This is what Hintze calls a revolution from above, to head off the danger that defeat in the war will lead to revolution from below. So it's constitutional change within Germany at the same time as an appeal to the American president. And here's the American president, Woodrow Wilson, who has to decide how to respond to this German public feeler. And what he does is to respond by sending a series of notes to the Germans. So imagine this, through October, there is a public exchange of notes between the Germans and the Americans. The British and French and Italians are to some extent sidelined from this, and fighting is still going on a very high scale on the Western Front at the same time as these public negotiations. But what Wilson does try to do is to tie the Germans down, to commit them to the 14 points as fully as possible to the American peace program, and to get absolute clarity that there has been a change of government in Germany. Now, this may suggest that the Americans are asking for regime change. Actually, what Wilson wants is to keep the Kaiser in place because he's afraid of more radical change in Germany leading to a red revolution there, something along the lines of what had happened in Russia. So he wants regime change, but not too much. This helps to explain why he's keen to consider a ceasefire now, rather than going on into 1919. But there are other reasons too. Fear of allies as much as Germany. He says, in fact, that he doesn't want the British and French to become so successful militarily that he loses political leverage over them. He's suspicious, from his point of view, London and Paris and Rome are imperialist almost as much as the Germans, but he's seen as he wants the Germans to be defeated, but not too much. This is also because of American domestic politics. Remember, Wilson is a Democrat, with capital D. His opponents, the Republicans, are coming back from electoral defeat. They get control of the House of Representatives in the midterm elections in November. Wilson knows that if the war goes on into 1919, then it will be harder for him to prevail with a relatively moderate peace settlement because of the situation domestically in America, as well as the British and French gaining more leverage over him in foreign affairs. And he's also worried about money, which I didn't realize until I did archival research on this, but he is being warned by his Treasury Secretary that taxes are not being raised enough to pay for the enormous cost of the war. And America is in serious danger of getting into inflation and not being able to finance the war effort if it goes on into 1919. So in other words, the point is that from Wilson's perspective, he wants the Germans to be defeated, but he doesn't want a total smashing defeat, and he wants to stop the war in 1918 rather than to carry on into 1919. Which is also true of the Allied leaders. Here's Vittorio Orlando, the Italian Prime Minister, who will basically follow what the British and French do, but is also suspicious of the Americans. So Americans have very publicly denounced Italy's war aims as too expansionist. It will depend on Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, and Lloyd George, and the British government's coalition government in London. And this is a quick summary of their point of view. The key thing really, you see, terms had to satisfy all parties. Everybody in 1918, at the end of the year, has come to the view that it is better to bring the war to an end than to pursue it for political reasons, which may seem a kind of contradiction. How can they all come to this consensus view? I explained this on the German side, but on the Allied side, the key thing to remember is the British and French are watching the Americans, and the Americans are watching the British and French, and there's a kind of balance of power between those three. Woodrow Wilson wants a moderate peace settlement. He wants, therefore, the war to end the war without a smashing French and British victory. The British and French, conversely, are afraid that if the war goes on into 1919, the Americans will dominate the Allied war effort. This is very clearly put by General Smuts, for example, a South African politician who's a member of the British War Cabinet. How the trick is managed of reconciling these is that there is a big conference in Paris at the end of October. The Americans get 12.5 of the 14 points accepted. One point is absolutely rejected by the British, which is the Americans want freedom of the seas. British fear that will overwhelm their right of blockade. But the military terms of the armistice and naval terms are decided by the French and British, by the British admirals for the naval terms, by Marshal Foch and the French military for the land terms. And for the British terms, the key thing is that Germany has to evacuate Belgium, so there will be no future German naval bases on the Belgian coast. They have to hand over their U-boats and their most modern battleships. The British are afraid that if the war goes on into 1919, they will no longer be able to keep their army up to 59 divisions. It'll fall to perhaps as few as 35. And Britain's bargaining leverage at the peace conference will be undermined. So it's better from the British point of view to stop the war now. And the French calculation is rather similar. As long as the peace treaty, the armistice terms, give them control of the territory they're interested in. And the armistice terms do require the Germans to evacuate Alsace-Lorraine in what had been in eastern France, to evacuate the whole of the Rhineland and to give up bridgeheads, give the Allies bridgeheads east of the river. The French are afraid that if the war goes on into 1919, their transport railway system will seize up and they will have an even more serious crisis for troop numbers than the British are facing. So the point is to summarize here, is that from the French, the European Allied side and the American side, but for different reasons, both think that November 1918 is the right time to stop, providing that the terms are right. And once they've come to that realization that there's nothing to be gained politically from carrying on, they all start talking about casualties. Foch, for example, says that carry on the fighting would mean the deaths of 50,000 or 100,000 Frenchmen for gains which are very questionable. Ludendorff from Germany says that he's lost 2 of his adopted sons in the fighting, and this has caused him great grief. After saying very little about casualties in previous years, now they no longer see a political point in continuing to fight. Then concern about casualties starts coming to the fore. Now, the final point is why the Germans accept what are much tougher Allied terms agreed between the Americans and British than initially been expected. 3 reasons. Number 1, the removal of Ludendorff. Essentially what happens is that Wilhelm sacks Ludendorff. Wilhelm shows uncharacteristic firmness, but orders Hindenburg to stay on, which Hindenburg does. It's a good obedient Prussian soldier. And that actually drives a wedge between the 2 men. Hindenburg and Ludendorff never speak to each other again after this. But Ludendorff is replaced by Wilhelm Groener, who you see in the map here, picture here, a South German and a logistical expert, who quickly comes to the conclusion and gives a firm warning to the government that it must make a ceasefire as soon as possible. A major reason for this is the collapse of Germany's allies. Bulgaria's gone, Turkey makes a separate ceasefire, Austria-Hungary is broken apart by a series of revolutions. Here is the one in Prague in late October, early November. So if Germany fights on, it will fight alone. And it will fight in a state of revolution. I can talk more about this in answers to questions, but the revolution is triggered by an attempt by the German Navy to launch a surprise attack against London and the Thames estuary. This never happens, because what happens is instead is that when the ships receive the order to start getting ready to go to sea, the sailors rebel. They put into port and they join forces with munitions workers in Kiel. The revolution spreads south from Kiel, largely non-violent, reaches Berlin on the 9th of November. Here's the scene outside the Reichstag on the day that Wilhelm II goes into exile in Holland. And the revolution spreads through the army, of course, as well as among civilians. So Groener believes that if the Allies, the danger now is of a smashing Allied breakthrough, they'll get into the middle of Germany, and the German army will no longer be reliable for putting down domestic disorder. So here is the Brainerd Daily Dispatch. I think this is in Minnesota. This is the American local newspaper reporting the news of the armistice is signed. Here's an American poster, which I put here because of the question, this might come up in questions. General Pershing, the American commander, is not at all happy with the armistice terms. He's a Republican, by the way. and as his sympathy is with much of the Republican Party, it's the war is being stopped too soon, and he makes a very forceful memorandum to that effect. Foch's reply, as I've already indicated, is that enough has been done to paralyze Germany, that the conditions in the armistice are sufficient, and there's no justification in further bloodshed, particularly no justification for further French bloodshed, for questionable political objectives. He's actually supported in that by Douglas Haig, the British commander-in-chief. And in many ways, I think their judgment was correct, because there is enough in the armistice terms to reduce the German army to helplessness and to oblige the Germans to accept the very harsh peace terms in the following year. But already by the end of very quickly after the ceasefire, the idea begins to spread in Germany that the German army has not really been defeated, that there's been some kind of fix, that the war has been ended by the revolution. This is a German poster highlighting what's called in Germany the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth. Here is a German red revolutionary stabbing in the back the heroic German soldier. What this means is that it's very difficult for the terms of the ceasefire to be accepted voluntarily in Germany, and there'll be a need for continuing Allied vigilance. But to finish, here is the scene in Armistice Day in London in front of Buckingham Palace on the 11th of November. See the American and Dominion flags on display in front of Buckingham Palace. A very raucous and noisy celebration. Many of the people concerned feeling, as above all, intense relief at having survived the conflict. Contrast this with Armistice Day 1919. This is a huge somber crowd during the 2-minute silence in Whitehall on the 11th of November 1919. Already, a year after the ceasefire had been signed, as looking back in retrospect, it's felt necessary by the British and other countries involved to make the 11th of November a permanent memorial. But contrast the mood, the joy, exultant joy in this one, and the silence, the somber silence in that one. There's a lot of irony, I think, in the story of the armistice. And I'd just like to finish with a quote from West of Amiens, the British First Lord of the Admiralty, First Sea Lord, who was present in the armistice railway carriage. He puts in his diary at the end of it, "It is a curious scene in the middle of the forest, raining and leaves falling, but there is nothing sad, at any rate for us." I'll stop there.
Marvellous, David. Thank you so much. Great. And Robert Illett will be rejoining us in just a moment as a panelist, just to ask his question.
Yes, one of the best talks about the war in general I've ever heard, and I greatly appreciate being able to be an attendee. My question is based upon the received wisdom that the German advances in the spring of 1918 took a lot of French agricultural land, but nothing of any strategic significance. At this stage, was Ludendorff aiming himself at strengthening his position to promote German interests at a peace conference, or was it purely coincidental?
Okay, so the question is about the motives for the Ludendorff offensives between March and July of 1918.
Correct.
Yeah, and you're quite right that what those do is leave the Germans in control of a lot of territory by comparison with the Somme Third Ypres, but most of that territory of not of great strategic significance. In particular, he's been much criticized for not trying to capture Amiens and Azebrook, which are two key railway junction points behind the British front lines. And he probably could have got Amiens if he'd concentrated all his resources in the March offensive on doing that. Azebrook would have been more difficult. And if you go back into the strategic planning for the Ludendorff offensives, it's also not very clear what the key strategic objective would be. You know, they could have been driving for the Channel ports. That would have made sense. Or they could have been driving to separate the French and the British armies. But Ludendorff sort of wavers, and there's a famous quote from him actually, where he says, "What we will do is to punch a hole in the line and then decide what to do next." That's how we did things in Russia. His priority is to break through the British and French lines, and then he will decide what to do next. So he selects points for the attack which are suitable tactically to achieve a breakthrough. That's particularly what he does with the March offensive, which is the biggest and most powerful of them. And his thinking seems to have been to do a kind of Somme in the reverse. It's a mirror image of British thinking and French thinking in 1916. He'd break through on the Somme area and then turn to the north, and then hopefully the British army would be defeated. He thinks the British army is the key concern. He thinks the French are less formidable. If he can defeat the British, then the French will surrender and he'll achieve a victory on the Western Front. But that's sort of in substance what I say in the book about, and what Afflerbach says actually in his book On a Knife Edge, that the Germans didn't think very clearly through what kind of strategic objectives they would be aiming to get control of with the Ludendorff offensives. And the end of it is they end up holding a lot of territory which they can't defend. They've lost 1 million troops, thereabouts. They've had very heavy casualties. They're holding a longer front line than before. They're now holding improvised positions in open country instead of the prepared positions that they'd occupied in the Hindenburg line. And that leaves them very vulnerable when the Allies do the counterattack from July of 1918 onwards. So I think it's possible to be very critical with good reason of the Ludendorff conduct of the offensives in the spring of 1918. Do you want to come back on that?
Yes, with respect, my question was, did Ludendorff at that time have an idea that he needed to strengthen the German position to show that they were not a defeated army when he went into peace talks?
Yes, I think that's the answer. Okay, he particularly wanted, he saw the fundamental problem, I think, was Belgium. And I mentioned in the talk that how Britain and Germany diametrically opposed about Belgium. But there's a very interesting memorandum done by Ludendorff's chief of operations, Wetzel, which says if we control Belgium, we threaten London and the Thames Estuary, and we threaten Paris. And that will stand us in good stead for the future. We must keep this war, we must carry on with this war until we can achieve the control of the strategic raw materials and railway junctions, lines of communication, that are needed so that we will be well placed in the next war. Because they're not assuming that this is going to be the last of them. Yeah? I think they're really thinking there's going to be a future ahead of indefinite wars against the British and French and Americans and perhaps the Russians as well. Yeah. On the German army, there is already signs by the end of 1917 that its morale is crumbling. What influenced Ludendorff and Hindenburg was the reports coming from the front line in the Third Battle of Ypres of the German troops defending there in Flanders, that their morale was getting very tenuous because they were tired of defensive fighting. And Ludendorff's hope was that by going on to the attack, he would actually restore morale among the German army, which otherwise is in serious danger of disintegration. So I think that evidence, which comes very clearly from the German official history, does, I think, support, I hope, the point that you were making.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah.
Just as a conclusion, can I say that the Sherwood Foresters were also a key part of the 46th Division, which broke through the Hindenburg line.
Yes.
In the miracle of the war, it wasn't just the Staffordshire.
No, you're right. No, it's a Midlands effort. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for your question, Robert. Okay, I have a couple of questions here. So Simon Bull has asked, how important do you think that the Allied blockade was in Germany's final defeat?
Okay, there's been a long debate about this. It's influenced British thinking. Basil Little-Hart is the person who particularly has famously advocated the view that the blockade was crucial. Most modern writers on 1918 don't come to that conclusion. The German food situation it's difficult in 1918, but they're not facing mass starvation. And the evidence, what influenced Hindenburg and Ludendorff on the home front was the fear that the socialists were pulling out of the governing coalition and that there would be some kind of revolutionary upheaval if it was clear that Germany had lost the war. But it's not. The German economy is remarkably robust, really. There's been interesting work being done on food research, actually, which I can mention. Another of my PhD students is doing this. He's looked at the German war bread, the Kriegsbrot, and he finds that it was actually very nutritious, because what the Germans were doing, and the British actually did the same thing. They were milling. They're putting into the milling flour a larger proportion of the wheat and bran than had been customary before the war. Before the war, the sort of prestige thing was to have white bread. During the war, the soldiers and civilians were being fed bread with wholemeal bread, if you like, with a high proportion of bran in it, which ran against prevailing views at the time about nutrition, but actually was nutritiously of good quality and not nearly as bad as is written in conventional accounts. Anyway, then there are other points that I could make about this, but the blockade is important, but the Germans do find answers to it. And they're not facing mass starvation as at the end of 1918. In fact, in some ways, their situation is better. It had been most difficult in the winter of 1916-17 after the failure of the potato crop, and that was the so-called turnip winter. By 1918, the food situation has actually improved. And my reading of it all, looking at the economic situation in Germany, is they could have kept the war going for at least another 6 months without the German economy collapsing for food, for shortage or any other reason.
Fantastic, thank you. I have a question from Mark Benbow. Thank you for that, Mark. Mark asks, I know there were Allied attacks right up before 11 a.m. on the 11th of the 11th, but were there German counter-attacks at the last minute, as there are in the recent All Quiet movie?
Not that I'm aware of, no. I think most of the contemporary accounts that I've seen about particularly the Americans, actually, to a lesser extent the British and French, continuing to attack until 11 a.m. I think, and I've seen the new German film of All Quiet on the Western Front, which is, is a very impressive cinematography. But a lot of the statements in it that didn't ring correct to me. I thought that was quite questionable about the factual accuracy. And it's also not very true to the novel. But there we go.
Thank you. Right, I have a question from Paul Cullum. Paul, thank you. Paul asks, the French-Serbian attack against Bulgaria seems an important trigger to events.
Yes.
What determined the timing of this? Could this have been tried earlier, given the debate about the Western Front or other fronts?
Yeah, there's a long inter-allied argument about it, and there's big command issues in the Balkans. The Balkan forces were under French command, and for a long time they were under the command of General Sarai, Maurice Sarai, who was supported by the left in France, and for reasons of domestic political truce in France, it was important to keep him there. But he was incompetent, and the British thought he was incompetent. The British for a long time wanted to pull out of the Macedonian campaign altogether and decided in the end not to do so because they thought it would have such serious repercussions in France. But without going into sort of more detail on this, there is actually a chapter in my book on it, but it's a change in command in France, which is put there by Clemenceau. Clemenceau changes the commander and puts in someone who is much more aggressive and provides more, so if you like, logistical support for the French forces on the Balkan front. Yes, okay. I mean, the relations, the Allied effort on the West and the Balkans was wound down in the beginning of 1918 because, of course, there was a need to put troops elsewhere while there was this tremendous crisis on the Western Front. By the end of 1918, that's eased enough the situation on the Western Front for them to start reinforcing the Balkans and for it to become feasible to do an attack on the Balkans. The other thing that makes it easier, I should have mentioned this, the Germans, of course, pulled troops out of the Balkans. There had been German troops down on that Macedonian front, which had made it much more difficult to break through. Nearly all of those are pulled out in the autumn of 1918. And the other thing is the demoralization of the Bulgarian army, which had been quite a formidable force up for the first half of the war. But there's a political change in Bulgaria, which I don't need to go into, I think. But the evidence reaching the Allies, which was correct, was that the Bulgarian army had also become demoralized, even though it had actually not done much fighting. So it was an opportune moment to attack.
Thank you. James Hayday asks, do you think the Allies regretted not carrying on the war?
Some did. Clemenceau says this actually quite soon, I think, to the Senate Commission on Foreign Relations in Paris, that if we'd known how bad things were in Germany, we would have imposed much harsher terms. And there are people on the British side who say the same thing, including, I think, Lloyd George. And Lloyd George, in fairness to him, had actually argued during the negotiations that harsh terms, severe terms should be imposed on the Germans. So yes, there are people people in high positions who in retrospect think that more should have been asked, that it should have been tougher. At the time, hardly anybody says this. At the time, the worry was that the Germans would reject the armistice package that the Allies were putting to them. And there was surprise and relief when the Germans accepted. But of course, the key thing that made the difference on the German side was the German Revolution, which I don't think the Allies had predicted. But that's why I showed you the picture of Buckingham Palace. You know, for the man and the woman in the street, I don't think there were many regrets or views that it had been premature.
Right. Alan Chapman asks, was the Russian Revolution important in undermining the morale of the German army from 1917 onwards?
It was, though I think it depends which bit of the German army you're talking about. But remember, a political truce had formed in Germany in 1914, so-called Burgfrieden. The key point was the SPD, the Socialist Party, who 30% of the vote, had rallied in support of the war effort because they had viewed it as a defensive war, a war of self-defense, which they could justify on ideological grounds. Once the Tsarist government mobilizes, of course, before Germany does in July 1914, and the German government is able plausibly to represent this as a war against Russian aggression that's been started by the Russians. That is much harder position to maintain after the summer and autumn of 1917, after the Russian Revolution. So I think that removes one of the ideological grounds that there's been a kind of war could be justified from the left as a war against reactionary Tsarism. But that's no longer feasible once you've got a provisional government and then the Bolsheviks in Russia. And also Russia just becomes less of a military threat. Another key element in the German government's defense of the war efforts, and the Knesset's argument for continuing to fight, was that Germany was encircled by enemies. Again, that is much harder to position to take once the Russia has essentially, Tsarist regime has been overthrown and much of the Russian army has gone home. So yes, it did contribute. It's not the only thing. There are all sorts of reasons why the German morale collapses, and I would put the most stress on what's happening on the Western Front. But what's happening in Eastern Europe is certainly an important contributor. And actually the decline in morale in the German army begins on the troop trains, moving from east to west. People spending days in confined, cramped conditions in cattle trucks being moved from the east to the west to take part in the Ludendorff offensives.
Great. Thank you. Just some comments, actually, just to round off. And forgive my pronunciation for this, but Rogerio de Oliveira Souza says, it's an honor to watch this lecture from Rio de Janeiro. I'm an admirer of Professor Stevenson and already bought and read many books written by him. And similarly, Christopher Weeks has said, having read the book, he can only encourage others to do so. And thank you for a wonderful evening's entertainment and an education. So I would say thank you very much for all of your questions. I'm sorry we haven't had time to get to all of them. But thank you very, very much, David, for this evening's talk.
My pleasure. And thank you very much for the nice comments.
Mademoiselle from Armistice, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armistice.